Hey there, movie fans. Welcome to another episode of Rank and File. I'm your host, Scott Movie Mantz. Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles. We're going to do the Beatles movies, rank them from worst to best. Now, I know there's only 5 Beatles movies, or at least 5 movies the Beatles did while they were actually together. So I'm going to throw in some honorable mentions along the way, and you'll see what I mean when we get there. But let's get right to it with number 5 on the list. It is Magical Mystery Tour. Directed by John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Directed by the Beatles. Was broadcast on December 26, 1967. That's Boxing Day in the UK, where it was broadcast in black and white. Magical Mystery Tour was the first thing the Beatles did that qualified as a bomb. UK critics hated it. They thought it was meandering, pointless, aimless. It had no direction. It had no story. Now, here's the great thing about Magical Mystery Tour. That, of course, is the music was great. The title song like Fool in the Hill. Then, of course, you have a song like I Am the Walrus. Now, over the years, Magical Mystery Tour has aged better since it was restored and remastered. It actually is pretty watchable. Moving on to the best spoof about the Beatles. It has to be the legend that will last a lunchtime. That is the Rutles with All You Need Is Cash. Directed by Eric Idle and Gary Weiss, broadcast on TV on March 22nd, 1978, the pre-Fab Four. Now, this is supposed to be a spoof of the Beatles, and it is a spoof, and it's very, very clever and very, very funny. But the Beatles' real story was already kind of crazy, one of those too good to be true kind of scenarios. So a spoof isn't really that far off the mark, and all the points hit really close to home to begin with. But it still is very, very funny, and the music written by Neil Innes is very, very good. Songs that could be great Beatles songs on their own, songs that kind of sound like Beatles songs, like Hold My Hand, Number One, Cheese and Onions, Get Up and Go. Very, very funny movie. Even a cameo from George Harrison, who thought it was hilarious. So yes, the Rutles. Number 4 on the list is Let It Be, directed by Michael Lindsay Hogg. Release date May 20th, 1970. It was an Oscar winner for Best Music Original Song Score and also a Grammy winner for Best Score Motion Picture. Watching Let It Be, the Beatles look miserable. Paul has his really thick beard. John is with Yoko. George looks like he doesn't want to be there. Michael Lindsay Hogg had directed a number of the Beatles' promotional films. These days we call them music videos. But the Beatles had to record this entire album at Twickenham Film Studios, and they were not morning people. The movie just captures them not really getting along. You see Paul and George argue. You see John, he just wants to be with Yoko, and you can see that Paul is coming across as really bossy. There's a lot of tension in this movie, but it does make it a very good film to watch. And of course, the movie ends with the rooftop concert, which was the very last time the Beatles played live, and that saves the movie. Next honorable mention, best movie about the Beatles, Backbeat, directed by Ian Softly, came out April 15th, 1994, played a few months earlier at the Sundance Film Festival. The movie is about John, Paul, George, Pete Best, and Stuart Sutcliffe. Stu Sutcliffe was the bass player for the Beatles from 1960 to 1962 before he ditched the Beatles to stay in Germany with his girlfriend Astrid, and then he died of a brain hemorrhage that year. So the movie captures a very specific period of the Beatles, a very little known story, and it's all the better for it. You're seeing the Beatles perform rock and roll in the dingy clubs of Hamburg. There is a rawness, a toughness, and an energy to Backbeat that makes it irresistible. Moving up to number 3, We All Live in a Yellow Submarine, directed by George Dunning. Release date July 17th, 1968 in the United Kingdom. Produced by Al Brodax, who did the Beatles cartoons from 1965. He also did Popeye. He also did Casper the Friendly Ghost. Now, after the Beatles manager Brian Epstein had passed away in August of 1967, one of the last things he wanted the Beatles to do was to make an animated feature. But the Beatles themselves couldn't really be bothered, So Al Brodax made a movie. He used other actors to play the voices of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Of course, the animation is glorious. It's beautiful, psychedelic, very trippy, timeless. And once the Beatles kind of saw how the movie was going, then they got into it. And that is why they filmed the live action coda at the end of the movie. As for the songs that the Beatles recorded for the movie, they were kind of throwaway songs, not up to their standards, although two of them, Hey Bulldog and It's All Too Much, were actually really good. All Together Now and It's Only a Northern Song, not so much. The thing that makes Yellow Submarine probably the most important release the Beatles ever did is that this is the way that so many kids have been introduced to the Beatles, by watching the movie Yellow Submarine. This is a movie that keeps getting handed down from generation to generation. It keeps getting re-released in theaters with parents taking their kids to see Yellow Submarine, and that is how they discover the Beatles, and that is why Yellow Submarine, while maybe not the best thing the Beatles have done, it is probably the most important thing the Beatles have done. Next honorable mention is Best Beatles Documentary, and there are quite a few to choose from. You have 8 Days a Week, the documentary directed by Ron Howard about the touring years. You have the 10-hour version of the Beatles anthology, which of course I love. And then you have the 1982 movie, The Complete Beatles, which is a great album-by-album documentary about the Beatles, only 2 hours long. It gets in and it gets out and it's done. But my favorite Beatles documentary is The Beatles, The First U.S. Visit, directed by Albert and David Maysles, along with Kathy Doherty and Susan Fromke. This movie came out in 1991 on Home Entertainment, and this movie is fantastic. If you're looking for a great fly-on-the-wall account of the Beatles' first trip to the United States in February of 1964, this is it. You're in their limo, you're in their private suite, you're on the train with them to Washington, D.C. for their first concert, you're walking with them through Central Park, and of course you got the Ed Sullivan appearances, and you have a portion of their first live ever concert in Washington, D.C. on February 11th, 1964. I think of the Beatles' first U.S. visit as A Hard Day's Night, but for real. Moving up to number 2, Help! Directed by Richard Lester. Release date July 29, 1965 in the United Kingdom. Budget $1.5 million. Grammy nominee for Best Original Score. Help, not as good as A Hard Day's Night, but it is still a whole lot of fun. A Hard Day's Night was the black and white movie. Help was in color, and boy, does that color pop. Richard Lester directed Help like a pop art movie. Each song, Ticket to Ride, Another Girl, the song itself, Help, I Need You, You Gotta Hide Your Love Away. It's like one music video after another. It is charming, it is delightful, but it's a little overwritten, and the Beatles felt like guest stars in their own film. And also, by this point, when they were making the movie in early 1965, the Beatles were smoking a lot of dope, and you could see it on their faces. There's like a glazed look over their eyes. They're not really into it. I think they could tell that the script wasn't as good as it was for A Hard Day's Night, but it is still really a lot of fun. Next on the honorable mention list, movie inspired by the Beatles. And talk about inspiration. You can't get better than 1978's I Wanna Hold Your Hand. Came out April 21st, 1978 to be exact. The budget was $2.8 million. The domestic gross only $1.9 million, so it was kind of a bomb. But here's the thing. I Wanna Hold Your Hand is the feature directorial debut of the one and only Robert Zemeckis, director of Castaway, Oscar-winning director of Forrest Gump, and of course the director of the Back to the Future trilogy. And this movie is terrific. It is charming. It is irresistible. It is so much fun. It really captures the joy and excitement of February 1964, when the United States was in the throes of the first wave of Beatlemania. The film, which is about 5 teenagers from New Jersey who will do anything, and I mean anything, to get into the Ed Sullivan Show to watch the Beatles' first performance on February 9th, 1964. This is so much fun. Uses real Beatles songs. And again, if you want to know what it was like, especially in New York in February of 1964, when the Beatles came to America, you could watch the documentary, The Beatles, the First US Visit, and then watch I Wanna Hold Your Hand. Now, moving on to number one on the list. Well, of course, it has to be A Hard Day's Night, directed by Richard Lester. Release date July 6, 1964 in the UK. Budget of $500,000. 2 Oscar nominations for Best Score for George Martin and Best Original Screenplay for Alan Owen, and also Grammy nominee for Best Original Score. A Hard Day's Night is a masterpiece film. It is one of the greatest movies ever made. 36 hours in the lives of John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and Paul's grandfather, all ending with a mini Beatles concert. It is a perfect movie. It solidified the individual personalities of the Beatles, of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And of course, the music is great. It is irresistible and very, very influential. The Can't Buy Me Love music video in the middle basically created MTV. And there you have it for the act you've known for all these years. Thank you so much for watching Rank and File. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please share Rank and File with other movie fans, and definitely share it with other Beatles fans. Please follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Movie Mantz. And until the next episode of Rank and File, love is all you need.